Hello and welcome back to this damnable idealistic crusade. This will be a review of Kino Lorber's release of the Universal horror film that is one of those that's not really a horror film. It's very much a gothic story. It is actually, of course, a Dickens adaptation. That is 1935's The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which was based on Dickens' final and unfinished novel, famously unfinished, that many have, for the past few, couple hundred years, have tried to figure out how the book ended, and it does seem rather straightforward how it would have ended, and Universal used it as part of their publicity campaign for the film, that they had to, with their scriptwriters, come up with a new ending for Dickens' tale, and it does seem to be the ending that is generally indicated by what was actually available of Dickens' final novel that he did not complete. So the film is really based on not just Dickens, but it's very much inspired by the success David O. Selznick was having with Dickens adaptations, particularly at MGM and then, of course, on his own. So this is coming in the wake of Selznick's larger-than-life productions that were very successful, and in 1935 alone, you had his classic version of A Tale of Two Cities. Universal could not really live up to that, and they still tried anyway. So they first did a version of Great Expectations, and then this film, and they were handsomely mounted, and they did have rather large budgets for Universal, which couldn't really afford that. And so when these films did not do well at the box office, it was just another sort of further nail in the coffin of the original Universal under the Laemmles, and they would, of course, lose the studio after the 1936 production of Showboat, which is really the sort of last gasp of the original Universal, and that of course also killed off the golden age of horror films as well after Dracula's Daughter. So Edwin Drood is one of those films that it is part of the Universal horror canon, but it doesn't hardly ever get mentioned because it isn't a horror film. It is a Dickens adaptation. But you have many of the sort of tried and true trappings of a Universal horror film, and you have both cast and crew who are notable Universal horror personnel, and you even have some sets that will pop up in other films if you look closely. The film was directed by Stuart Walker, who would shortly thereafter do Werewolf of London in the same year, and of course it stars not only Valerie Hobson but Claude Rains, and the sets also have some shared usage in Bride of Frankenstein, and I think you'll get to your biggest Bride of Frankenstein flashes when, of course, you have the local official played by the incomparable E.E. Clive in his absolutely iconic fashions, much in the same way that he does in Bride of Frankenstein, but here he plays the sort of useless town official. So it is a film that should be considered part of the Universal horror canon, but this is probably the biggest example of don't go into this thinking it's a horror film, because everyone who comes to this film for the first time seeing it, which is even discussed in the commentary, you're in for a surprise because it is not a horror film. But Dickens did frequently sort of delve into what we would consider now horror elements, and this story, while one of the most straightforward stories he would come up with, it is very much a romantic melodrama with gothic and horror overtones, but it's still very melodramatic. This definitely gets into horror elements. So Universal trying to sell this as a horror film, it makes sense. You could see why they would do this. The story, for those who aren't familiar with Dickens' final unfinished novel, deals with really a choir master played by Claude Rains, who is so obsessed with the betrothed fiancé of his adopted nephew Edwin Drood, played by the great David Manners, that he continually conspires after her and lusts after her, and finds himself seeking solace, and the only thing he has available, at least I guess the only way he can try and find solace, is through opium. So the film actually opens in an opium den, which is really striking and beautifully shot and performed, although it is having to skirt around, rather interestingly, the fact that this is Claude Rains' character in an opium den having opium dreams and delirium. by not actually saying it's opium, but of course it's quite obvious what he's doing. So it's a very striking opening for a 1935 film, and I think they got away with it because they were adapting Dickens, and it's a literary classic. Otherwise, I don't think the production code would have allowed any sort of that scene to ever have been shot. But he does this in order to, it's a sort of secret life he has, or at least allowing his own personal demons to come out, and setting up the fact that this is going to be one character who is quite obviously from the get-go consumed by demons and, shall we say, messed up. So it sets the sort of story in motion that he lusts after the sort of forbidden love, the fiance of Edwin Drood, and the Drood character basically is rather romantic and sort of disconnected from reality in that he doesn't seem to have much of a care in the world, and rather amusingly, he and his fiancée don't really even get along, and they're just going along with a prearranged marriage that had been set up really since they were children. So you get the sort of story structure and focus on class structure that Dickens is well known for. Into this mix are thrown actually a pair of twins who come into town and who are treated, obviously a bit differently because they are quote unquote foreigners, and you get more of the class conscience, and there is a sort of stigma attached to them simply due to their ethnicity. They are played by, again, Valerie Hobson and Douglas Montgomery. Montgomery's character immediately sees the heroine of the film, and of course they're completely in love from just about the first sight, of course, as these things go, and of course that leads to complications, and Montgomery's character is quick to anger and gets into an altercation with Edwin Drood, and you can see this start to set the wheels in motion in the mind of the Jasper character played by Claude Rains. And of course, when shortly thereafter, during a very violent storm that almost destroys the town, when Edwin Drood suddenly disappears under mysterious circumstances, it doesn't take adding two and two to realize that someone probably decided to act upon this and to do away with the seemingly ineffectual Edwin Drood as a means to his own ends. So it's not really a mystery. It's pretty straightforward, because the most fascinating thing in the picture, without question, is Claude Rains' performance as Jasper. He is, I mean, I've said on occasion, if I had to choose, among the screen's greatest actors and performers, Claude Rains is definitely among there. He is one of the greatest actors who ever lived, I think. His range was incalculable. He could play anything and invest it with full vitality. And this character is rather interesting because you could see him portrayed in a number of ways, and there are all kinds of different facets. And this being Universal, even though it's a sound film, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I could even see this having been done as a silent film with Lon Chaney. There's even that sort of aspect to the Jasper character, and because it's a Universal period drama, it would slot in right there with Hunchback of Notre Dame if it had been done as a Chaney vehicle. But the way that Rains plays him is so deeply nuanced, but always having the internal demons within, and you can see it sort of seeping through in all of his pretended civility, and of course it's not helped by his visits to the opium den, and even there in his bits of delirium, where all of these sort of passions and internal darkness just comes to the surface in full delirium. I mean, Rains is just mesmerizing, and that's why it's a shame he's not in the film a whole lot. It is technically the main character, but it's more of an ensemble piece, and so most of the screen time overall winds up being split between Rains and then eventually the Douglas Montgomery character, who becomes the sort of fall guy for the death of Edwin Drood. And then we get this sort of interesting mystery of the sort of second half of the film, where he has to go away and then try and discover how he can try and clear his name under different auspices, if you will. So those are really the two key performances, but you also get sprinkled in appearances from other Universal Star Wars that I mentioned before, particularly in the form of David Manners playing Edwin Drood. It's really sort of a thankless role because he is sort of, as a character, sort of the means to get the story going, and he's, again, a very ineffectual character, but rather interestingly, you can see Manners really relaxed on screen, and he's clearly enjoying himself playing this role and not having to play the juvenile lead of Universal horror films and usually most other films. He was usually cast in that sort of position. So he has a really wonderful natural quality here, and of course he plays off of Rains beautifully because Claude Rains could, I think, make every actor in the world look even better than what they would normally do, simply from elevating the entire scene around him and finding every nuance of the scene to be played, and then again lifting the surroundings and every actor up with him to elevate the whole experience, because that's how much of a consummate professional he was. But it's wonderful seeing David Manners in this film getting to, again, give a more relaxed performance, and it's, you know, a world apart from his Jonathan Harker in Dracula that we all love, but you know, we also love to sort of poke fun at what they make him do in Dracula and how he seems a little stiff here and there. So you don't have that sort of quality we associate with the typical David Manners performance, because again, he was usually being thrown in as the young juvenile lead. So it's wonderful seeing him here. As I mentioned before, we have E.E. Clive, the wonderful character actor, who is, again, playing one of his inimitable figures of authority, who is totally useless but so charming and so wonderfully doddering in his way that you can't help but love him, even though he must be, if this person really existed that he's playing this character, it must be, you know, the most insufferable person to try and ever have to deal with. And then we also have the great Valerie Hobson, who is probably most famous for Universal horror fans for being in Bride of Frankenstein. I've always loved her energy on screen, particularly in Bride of Frankenstein, and some of the other Universals she would turn up in, but unfortunately she's really wasted here. She's just kind of there. She has a couple scenes, but is otherwise just more window dressing for the story, unfortunately, which it is a shame, because she's always great. I think it would have been a little better if they had actually swapped the female lead roles and had Valerie Hobson playing the lead character of Rosa. And that's nothing against Heather Angel, because the character we have in the film is much more along the lines of the very sort of perfect, almost angelic female type character, very you know, you have all these people sort of looking after her and worshiping her. So she sort of has a little bit of the quality of the heroine in Murders in the Rue Morgue in that sort of sense. So in some ways, it's kind of hard to understand why the Jasper character is so enraptured with this character of Rosa, because she doesn't seem to do a whole lot. So it might have made a little bit more sense to have Valerie Hobson in that role, because she could at least have added a little bit of maybe grit and determination. But again, that's nothing against Heather Angel in the film. It's just how the character is and how it's written, and that seems to be intrinsic to Dickens' source novel anyway. But it's just kind of a shame that Hobson just seems to kind of be there and sort of in a thankless part. And then again, the other main draw is Douglas Montgomery, who actually manages to have quite a bit of fun with the character he's playing, but again, more in the sort of second half, when he actually comes back in a disguise to try and uncover the actual mystery behind Edwin Drood's disappearance, and under the having to go under disguise because he's wanted as the chief suspect. So he goes away and then comes back under heavy disguise, and that's the sort of fun of the second half of the picture. Now, I do think when you watch this, it is a tad long. It is, clocking in at about 90 some odd minutes, so it doesn't have the more brisk pace of the usual Universal horror, and again, it's not really a horror film, but it has a lot of sort of gothic flavor, and it has the trappings of a horror film, and they tried to sell it as a horror film as well. And again, it was supposed to sort of be a follow-up to their Great Expectations production, which was not very successful, and then this film was not really successful at all. So two major productions that they spent quite heavily on for Universal not doing well meant that it was too further sort of death nails in the coffin of the original Universal under the Limleys. But it is to be admired for the fact that this was Universal really trying to mount a more prestige production. They are doing a Dickens adaptation. They are putting production values into it. They are straining beyond their budget. It's, of course, never going to be as lavish as Hunchback of Notre Dame or even Phantom of the Opera from their silent days, but it is getting back to trying to do that sort of thing again. And that's something they always wanted to do with Dracula and Frankenstein, but they couldn't, being in the worst of the Great Depression. This is where they are at least trying to get back to sort of more of what they were doing in the silent period, again, on what budgets they could have. Even if this was lavish for them, it couldn't stand up against what Selznick was doing. So again, if you look at Selznick's Tale of Two Cities from the same year, I mean, it's just no comparison in terms of just scale and production design and attention to quality detail and things. But you can see this is Universal trying to do that. And for the most part, I think it does rather well. And it's, having to come up with an entire new climax because the book didn't have one because it was unfinished. People still debate on how the book would have ended, but it does seem pretty obvious and pretty clear that what Universal came up with is the sort of logical conclusion, and it does fit. It's just, as a film, though, when you look at it and you look at the way it's written, I think the reason why I thought of Chaney before is you could actually, I think, picture this as being a silent film very, very easily. It's in terms of you're not necessarily getting a lot of character detail. You get some sense of the sort of world that sort of Dickensian quality that is present throughout Dickens's work. But I don't think you ever really get the full impact of it like you would when Selznick did Dickens, or especially later on when David Lean would make his famous versions of Dickens classics in Great Expectations and Oliver Twist. So it's sort of in this interesting middle ground of it's really trying, and it's at Universal, so I think you have to give them extra credit for really trying. But ultimately, it's a little unsatisfying because with the amount of screen time it has, I wish there had been more focus on the two primary characters played by Douglas Montgomery, and especially we needed more with Claude Rains, because every time he's on screen, it's fascinating and you're hooked into what's going on, and then he disappears for a while, and then your interest starts to dissipate and vary and go away, and then you're just waiting for Claude to show up again. It is a majestic performance, what we have in the film, and it is absolutely the reason why you have to see The Mystery of Edwin Drood. It is the key to take away from it. I also couldn't help but thinking, this film has the wrong director, because why would you not have James Whale direct this? I mean, if this had been James Whale, it would have been, absolutely magical. Of course, he was doing Bride of Frankenstein in 1935, but, you would think that doing a Dickens adaptation with the world building and trying to have some horror elements and having all of the eccentric characters and having a central Claude Rains performance and even having E.E. Clive in there, I mean, it just screams, why didn't James Whale do this? Because then it would have really had that energy, and I think it's a shame. I think he could have made a hell of a great picture with this, even if it had the same script. I really do. But it's just, it wasn't to be. And Stuart Walker does do well, but, this is an example, I think, of Universal making pictures that could have been, what would be termed, I guess, artier. And of course, the biggest example is Dracula's Daughter was started by James Whale and almost was a James Whale production and would have been another of his masterpieces. What did we get was, we didn't get that. We got the interesting and fun Dracula's Daughter with a lot of interesting ideas in it, but, they gave it to Lambert Hillier, who was not James Whale, shall we say, who could do good work. And again, Dracula's Daughter is a sort of classic in its own right and has a lot of great things to recommend in it and a lot of things to enjoy. But when you read about what was the original concept and that it was going to be James Whale, you're just like, oh God, this is one of the great films that never was. And so I just couldn't help the whole time revisiting this. The whole time I'm just thinking, why didn't James Whale do this? So again, it's not to sell the picture short, but it does leave you a bit unsatisfied, I think, when you finally see it. I do think it's important to see, and I do think you have to give it extra credit points for, if you were grading a film like a paper, for this being Universal really trying. And it is a shame that it didn't at least get a decent enough reception, because it is well mounted and they did put money into it, and it's just unfortunate they had a number of things that I guess you could term were maybe more ill-advised, like this, where it probably was not going to be the big return at the box office they were hoping for. So it might have been a better idea to perhaps spend a little bit less on it, or shelve it for a little while till things were a little bit more financially stable. But, they were taking risks and they were really trying, and it is well mounted, and it is quite a very good adaptation of the Dickens novel, which is a hard book to adapt because it is rather straightforward, and again, it was unfinished. So we turn to the Kino Lorber Blu-ray release now, and this, like Secret of the Blue Room, is a film that has been overlooked on home video for an extraordinary long time. Previously, it had a VHS release, and then it finally got a Universal Archive, or I should say Vault Series MOD DVD a number of years ago. Exactly like Blue Room, that was a very underwhelming interlaced standard def disc, again, old standard def master, possibly dating back and even being what was used for the VHS tape. I've never owned or seen that. I've only seen this film before in some of the versions you'll find floating around, which seem to be dupes or copies of the VHS tape, which itself didn't really pop up all that often. So I've only seen this before in rather poor or not very good quality, and it has not ever really been appreciated or even hardly discussed, if ever. Secret of the Blue Room is much the same way, but at least that gets talked about a little bit more. This, because it's a Dickens adaptation, it wasn't successful, it's very obscure, and it's been obscure on home video, makes it even less discussed because the horror connections are very, very, very minor. So when Kino announced they were bringing it to Blu-ray, it was a real shock and surprise, and nice for them to do it along with Blue Room to sort of have two Universal horror titles that were severely overlooked finally get a Blu-ray release. Now, I wish I could say this was a beautiful new scan with a full restoration and everything. Some places do credit it as a 2K scan when you try to read about it online, but again, there's no information on it, just like Secret of the Blue Room. It has to be some kind of new scan because it is HD, and it does seem to be far beyond what was on the VHS and the MOD DVD. However, like Secret of the Blue Room, this is not a full restoration, and it's seemingly just a scan of the best source element Universal had. That would be understandable, and it makes sense that obviously Universal can't put money into everything, but you would think with it being in the Universal horror realm, which is the most iconic thing in the Universal library. When you say Universal, the connection to the horror films is so deep that the first thing most people are going to think of is Universal horror. So I've always thought it was odd that Universal has never put the prime effort into what is really the crown jewel and most iconic thing in their library, which is their classic horror films, including the gothic period pieces like this and Secret of the Blue Room and the mystery films and the non-monster films. So essentially, this is pretty much preserving the best source that Universal has currently. Now, like Secret of the Blue Room, this is not going to be a pristine presentation. However, I was not prepared for just how damaged and how really unimpressive this presentation could be, because to say that this element has damage is an understatement. This is a really rough presentation, and I mean, when I say rough, it's very rough. It does thankfully start to clear up, so by towards the final act or the final third of the film, things are much better. You will encounter all sorts of nastiness in this transfer. There is severe print wear in places. So there's scratches, there's dust, there's some tearing, there's damage, there is tons of frame wobble and gate weaving. There are at least a few hairs here and there. It does seem to be very much confined to at least the first half, so the first couple reels seem to have the most damage, and you can very much tell it's going varying from reel to reel in terms of the severity of the damage. But there are points where the transfer is rather dark. There's points where it's quite bright. It has not been restored. There are some missing frames. I actually noticed there's one spot where there are two blended frames, which was rather odd to see. I guess that's either baked into the source or it's a particular problem with this title, but you're going to just run into all kinds of stuff. So basically, this is the disc equivalent of seeing a studio best available print run at an art house theater. It is very rough in places. There's actually another point where it seems like they had to use some dupe material copied from another source, because in one scene the quality suddenly drops dramatically, and it seems to be sourced from an entirely different element. I don't know if it's 16 millimeter, but that's the type of quality reduction. It doesn't last for very long. It goes back to the quality of the rest of the scene, but it is rather jarring. So this seems to be the sort of best preservation element Universal has, but it has not been cleaned up at all. I mean, they did a scan and they made a master of it. Like, it's that seems to be it, and the rest is hands off. It is the roughest looking transfer I've seen from a studio source in a very, very long time. Now, that's not to say this is a terrible presentation, because it is what it is, and Kino has made a good disc out of this master. So it is actually in HD. It looked, far beyond the old versions that were floating around that, again, seemed to be copied off of the VHS tape, and, again, the old standard def MOD disc, which itself was interlaced, and presumably the VHS master as well. So I don't think you have to bother with those old releases now that we have an HD presentation of a newer scan. And when the damage isn't too bad, and particularly by the halfway point, and then in the final third especially, when it sort of cleans itself up, when the damage sort of dials itself down and isn't so intrusive, it does look rather good. But it's never what it could be. You compare this to Universal titles that have been fully restored, and it's very obvious this hasn't had any work put into it. And Secret of the Blue Room fares better because the element is in better shape, because it had the same sort of hands-off treatment. We did a new master, and this is it. But yeah, it's very rough. It's going to put off a lot of people who come to this. If you can't deal with damage, or lots of damage and element fluctuation and things like that, if that bothers you, you're going to have a really rough time with this disc. And again, that's entirely due to this being Universal Master without restoration work done. It's rather surprising, again, that Universal wouldn't put some time and effort into other parts of the horror canon, but they rarely have done that in the past, so it's not entirely surprising that they would do that again. But this is really rough. I mean, I have to say, I can understand the element not being in the best shape and maybe not having the original negative to scan, but this is rough. I mean, I hope the screen caps that I'm including will indicate just the severity of what I'm talking about. But I can live with a lot of things, and I've seen a lot of beaten up prints before, so it's nothing new for me. But films shouldn't have to be this way if there is an option to have an actual restoration, particularly from a studio. Like, this is the type of presentation that should have a little disclaimer, like when you go to a theater and they get a really rough print, and they'll actually give a sign saying, if you don't want to see a really rough print, don't buy a ticket for this. This should have that type of disclaimer. It's not anything, obviously, that Kino did, because they're simply using the master provided. And it is better than the old standard def versions that we had before. But just bear in mind, this is an extraordinarily rough presentation, and the roughest master from a studio I have seen for a very, very long time. So it's unfortunate that no restoration work has really been done on this title, because it really needs it. I mean, this is a very rough presentation, but again, thankfully, when the damage isn't super intrusive, it does clean up rather well, but it needs quite a lot of work. It's a shame that the film has been released in this state without any sort of cleanup work done or applied. But it is what it is, and at least it is an upgrade over the sources we had before. It is getting the film back out into print, so hopefully it'll be discussed and discovered and talked about now. And we do have a Blu-ray of The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which is something I thought would never happen. Now, in terms of the audio, it's just as rough as the picture. There is tons of noise, tons of crackle and hiss. There is some distortion in the music cues, and that's a bit more of a problem than usual. While that's a standard thing to have in films of this era, this film has quite a lot of music, and in fact, I think it's a bit detrimental because I think the music is a bit too strident in a lot of scenes that it's not really required in. So the fact that there's more music than normal for a film of this era really accentuates the high-end distortion that'll come up, but you're not really going to be paying attention to that because the whole track is so noisy and not of very good quality, and it's simply due to the source they're transferring and stuff baked into the source, and the fact that this hasn't had any restoration work done to it. So the audio is just as problematic as the picture. It is seemingly better than the much more, even more muffled version I've seen before, again, based off of the old VHS tape, but I've never owned the physical original releases to do a direct comparison. I'm just going off of memory. So while the audio is a lossless DTS HDMA mono presentation, it is very rough in quality. It will be very rough going for people. Like the picture, when things clear up at times, it is serviceable. It's always serviceable, but just keep in mind it is very much compromised, just like the picture. So overall, this is one of the roughest transfers from a studio I've seen in years. It should be noted going in that it's a very rough presentation. It does distract from the film for really the first half of it. And it should be noted that for those who can't live with severe damage, this will be very rough going for at least the first half of it. But it is the best presentation of the film we've ever gotten, and it's still amazing this film has finally gotten a Blu-ray release. So Kino Lorber's Blu-ray uses an original poster design, which looks lovely on the case. Gives you sort of the mysterious and gothic and sort of horror overtones, the way Universal tried to originally sell the film. Then it's in their standard case design, which means, of course, just a standard plain Kino label on the disc. Now, this does have some extras. We have a trailer gallery with other Kino titles. Unfortunately, there is no trailer for the film, so just like Secret of the Blue Room, there's no trailer for the film on the disc, I guess because there's no surviving trailer that Universal has. Unfortunately, for most of the horror films, that's just how it goes, and so when we actually do have a trailer, or a fan or historian or collector scans a trailer, it's reason to celebrate. Most of the trailers that survive are unfortunately cut down reissue trailers from years later. But they have commissioned a commentary, and this is the main draw because the commentary is by the great David Del Valle. This is a wonderful gem of a commentary track. Even if you're not as big on the film and the transfer doesn't really help that, and so you come away not having a good time with the film, the commentary is really well done. It's not a surprise because David Del Valle has done a number of great commentaries, but he talks about the film, its production, its sort of place in Universal horror, how they tried to sell it, even though it was a Dickens adaptation. He talks a lot about Dickens' unfinished novel and where the film starts to sort of have to make up its own conclusion in the third act. He sort of tries to mark the point at which the screenwriters take over from Dickens, which is really helpful. He also talks about the cast and crew personnel, especially a lot about Claude Rains and his extreme genius as an actor. And then, of course, quite a lot about David Manners. And probably the best parts of the track is where David Del Valle has a lot of personal remembrances, because as somebody growing up who came to this film in the shock television packages mixed in with the other Universal horrors, he had the same reaction I think all of us do when we finally get to see this. It's sold as a horror film, and you start it and you very quickly realize it's not a horror film, so that'll usually put most people off. But if you stick stick with it, there's a lot to recommend in there. But he also talks about his interviews and time he spent with David Manners, which is really revealing because Manners did not really have put much stock in his Hollywood career, and particularly could never understand why people always wanted to talk about his Universal horror work, because he never saw them as anything worthwhile and seemed sort of annoyed by what he had done in his Hollywood career, particularly the horror films. So Del Valle talks quite at length about the various times he tried to interview David Manners and get past that and try and eke out any information he could get. And this is apparently something most historians encountered when they tried to talk to David Manners as one of the surviving people still around from the Universal golden age of the horror films, and he, how charming and amusing Manners could be, but also the sort of amusement of trying to get information out of him, and then getting really candid about the final time that they talked. And it's a really wonderful commentary track. There's not really any dead spaces, and Del Valle has a wonderful, warm conversational tone. This is going in my regular rotation of October commentary tracks I listen to. I usually listen to all the great ones when I rewatch the films every October, whether it be the Universal horror commentaries or the Val Lewton commentaries or the Hammer horror commentaries. I usually re-listen to the really great ones when I rewatch the films every year, so this goes into that rotation. It is a fantastic commentary. It's worth purchasing the disc for Del Valle's commentary. It is an exceptional track, and again, it helps. The transfer isn't very good, so at least it has a great commentary to sort of compensate for that. So I do think the commentary makes this a recommendable purchase, even if the transfer does, due to the severe damage to the source element, does hold back the overall presentation of the film. I think the addition of Del Valle's excellent commentary really pushes it over the top, and so I do still wholeheartedly recommend this release as an essential title for Universal horror fans and horror fans in general, and Dickens fans. But the main draws of this are Del Valle's commentary, actually finally getting this film in HD with a new transfer, even though the source is very damaged. But most of all, the incredible lead performance by Claude Rains, who is absolutely mesmerizing every time he's on screen, which pretty much goes for every film he was ever in, because he never gave a bad performance. And I do consider him one of the greatest actors who ever lived. So those are my thoughts on Kino Lorber's Blu-ray release of the Universal Horror 1935 classic, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. While it's unfortunate the film has never gotten a full restoration and still hasn't, the HD presentation as it stands is at the very least better than the two releases that came before. The film has been long overdue for an upgrade. It's just a shame that Universal only has apparently this extremely damaged element to work with, and this is more of a sort of preservation scan and presentation on this master from the studio, as opposed to actually having some restoration work done to it. So I do want to put that disclaimer out for everyone, because again, I was really surprised by just how prevalent the damage was in picture and sound, and that is something that people should be aware of. Again, Kino has done a great job of presenting the master they were given, and I really think the David Del Valle commentary is worth the entire purchase price of the disc alone. But I want to stress that the source they had to work with, that Universal had to work with, is very damaged in places, and this is still a film that needs a restoration, just like Secret of the Blue Room does, because these are important parts of the Universal horror history. Even if they themselves are not really horror films, they are part of the Universal horror canon and should be considered as such. And when you read the proper great books about Universal horror, particularly Universal horrors, they are given their own chapters in sequence because they are part of the Universal horror canon. So until that happens, where these might get upgrades, which unfortunately is not very likely. So this is pretty much, I think, the best we're ever going to get for these titles, unless Universal changes their mind somehow. I do wholeheartedly recommend this along with Secret of the Blue Room. They are very inexpensive at the usual Kino prices, and when you get them during one of Kino's site sales, they are very inexpensive. So that might help if you're sort of on the fence on getting these, and especially knowing they're not, fully restored, and particularly Edwin Drood is filled with severe damage. But for the low cost, and at least having a new scan of sorts and an HD presentation, and actually having these films on Blu-ray, which still is mind-boggling, and they're not locked away in an expensive box set or something, I think it's really worth your time. And I think the commentaries, particularly this David Del Valle commentary on Edwin Drood, is really worth the cost of the whole disc. So again, even if you don't really like the film all that much and you're really disappointed in the quality of the transfer, the commentary does help to make up for it, because it is really, really well done. It's a track you'll return to quite frequently, because it's an exceptionally good commentary. So again, that's my thoughts on Kino Lorber's release. I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts in the comments below, particularly on the strengths of the transfer, because again, the level of damage is quite severe in places, and I'd be curious to know what you guys may have taken from this, if you've seen or owned this disc and viewed it for yourself, because it is an interesting film with good elements in it. It is part of the Universal horror canon, but it was very surprising to see an official studio newer scan of a title be this prevalently damaged throughout. So it's really unfortunate, but I think that's just until somebody decides to actually restore this film, I think that's about as good as we're going to get. So again, I do wholeheartedly recommend this release. It's essential for classic horror fans, for Dickens fans, for Universal horror. It's a must. It is part of the canon, even though, again, it is not a horror film. So as always, I hope my babblings about classic films have been at least somewhat fun and informative. Keep supporting boutique labels and studio labels by buying films on disc in order to keep physical media alive. And as always, thanks ever so much for watching.